Namaskar and a hearty welcome to everybody, and a special thanks to such a lively song. I liked it very much. Yeah. Over the past several talks, we've been looking at life, especially spiritual life, as a journey of the soul to its ultimate destiny of freedom. As you know, according to Advaita Vedanta, this absolute freedom is attainable only through knowledge and not by any other means. Jnane naiva muktihi nanyatha. Which presupposes that our soul, is now ignorant. What is the nature of this ignorance and what constitutes true knowledge? And how can the soul rid itself of ignorance? This is the theme of today's class, today's talk. Let us begin with Sri Ramakrishna's words. He says, the feeling of I and mine has covered reality. Because of this, we don't see the truth. Attainment of divine consciousness is not possible without the knowledge of non-duality. Even Sri Ramakrishna says almost the exact what Shankaracharya has said. Jnane naiva muktihi nanyatha. Attainment of divine consciousness is not possible without the knowledge of non-duality. After realizing divine consciousness, one enjoys eternal bliss. One enjoys this bliss after attaining the state of a Paramahamsa. And then this simple illustration of Sri Ramakrishna's, where he says, the intervention of the ego creates the difference between Jiva and Atman. Water appears to be divided into two parts if one puts a stick across it. But in reality, there is only one water. It only appears as two on account of the stick. The I is the stick. Remove the stick, and there remains only one water as before. So we have two things here, the I and the Atman, the ego and the self. The ego and the self stand at two opposite ends of the spiritual journey. Our exploration begins with the ego and culminates in the realization of the self. Now, broadly speaking, the ego can be taken as that part of the mind which expresses individuality. It is the ego that gives us the sense of I and mine. So, the ego is in many ways the mouthpiece of the personality. The total personality is, of course, a very complex thing. It is not easy to understand how deep its roots are. Various factors in the body and mind, internal physiological structures, biological urges, emotions, and a number of other elements are involved in the personality's makeup. But so far as the vehicle of its expression, the ego, so far as that vehicle is concerned, there is not much difficulty in understanding and grasping it. Every moment of our lives, we are keenly conscious of ourselves as individuals. When we think or speak or do anything, we know that the ego, our I sense, is present. Its role is paramount in our everyday lives. As a rule, there can't be any activity, mental or physical, any understanding, feeling, or desire without the sense of individuality in the background. The ego is the master player of our mental plane. It is the thread that pulls the different elements of the individuality together and gives it cohesion, a unity. Now, when the ego functions, it associates itself with a wide variety of objects. By itself, the ego is a neutral entity, but this neutrality ends in the field of operation. The ego has to identify with something, otherwise it can't express itself. For example, when it identifies itself with the body, then I say, I'm tall or short, I'm fair or dark. When I say, I'm thinking, my ego has associated itself with the mind. When I say I'm angry, then with the emotion of anger. So the ego in action changes from moment to moment. This moment it is linked with a certain function of the body, and the next moment with the state of the mind, or with any other external circumstance. There is no limit to the things or ideas with which the ego can connect itself. Even when we speak of ethical or cultural aspects of life, even there, the ego is very much present. It has only changed its center of identification. It now associates itself with some ethical qualities. I'm a good person. I'm virtuous. I'm truthful. I'm straightforward. Or with some cultural affiliations. I belong to this or that group. I'm a scientist. I'm an artist. I'm a philosopher. In all these various instances of identification, the ego connects itself with a definite understanding, I am this or that. But there are some extraordinary instances where the identification is implicit. The ego can identify itself with ideas of vastness or timelessness, though it is not fully conscious of this fact. For example, we implicitly believe that we are not going to die, that we are all our thoughts and actions betray this strong assumption that we'll always be here, that we are immortal. But this belief is not clearly recognized. It is subconsciously assumed. Similarly, the ego occasionally experiences feelings of pure joy, boundless awareness, or profound peace. Unfortunately, we lack the time, or more often, we lack the courage to deeply ponder our kinship with these spiritual feelings. But there is nevertheless an implicit identification in the background of our consciousness, and we can't shake it off. As a matter of fact, if we didn't have this kind of cosmic ego identification, so to say, if we didn't have that, life here would be miserable. We couldn't survive if every moment we feared death and were always conscious of suffering, limitation, and ignorance. Fortunately for us, there is occasionally a sort of unrecognized, implicit identification of the ego with the infinite and eternal. However, this identification is not clear in our ordinary consciousness because it is still superficial. It doesn't go deeply enough into the personality. We use the word personality so often, but we don't care to discover the personality's true foundation. We don't even fully know what the mind is. We human beings have deeper levels of existence than the mind and personality, though in daily life it may not be necessary to analyze or understand them. Anyhow, if we think deeply, the implicit identification of the ego with the eternal and infinite points to a basic reality both behind the individual personality and behind the universe. This reality Vedanta calls self, Atman or Brahman. The self is the core of the mind and personality, and it is also the core of the external world that we perceive. When we probe deeply enough, we and our universe become one. The self is that unity. We live and move in that unity. We can never escape our own nature. We are generally satisfied with the superficial manifestations of our personalities, but there is always an unknown element of our existence which the ego occasionally encounters. In some rare moments in our lives, we feel its presence as timelessness, as infinite calmness and bliss, or as a vast, undefined awareness. What I'm trying to say is, just as in our daily life, the ego is the mouthpiece of the personality, the instrument by which the personality can work and manifest itself. In the same way, also in the field of self-inquiry, the ego serves as a pointer to the true basis of the personality, which is the self. The first role of the ego, I am so and so, that we all understand. But its second role, that is, its role of cosmic identification, understanding that takes some amount of analysis and discernment. Many people never even have a clue that there is a vast reality in the background of their lives. Perhaps these people haven't had any opportunity for introspection. For them, the self remains unrecognized and undiscovered, perhaps for many lives. The desire to look deeply into life depends on a person's temperament and samskaras. For those who take the question of spiritual life seriously, that vast, immortal being, the ground of our existence, cannot be allowed to remain unknown and undiscovered. The highest goal of spiritual life is to realize that ultimate ground, to know that at all times we are one with all that exists. Of course, we have to begin with the ego, but our goal is to go forward until the ego discovers the self. The primary function of the ego is to identify itself with this and that. The ego can't help it. We have to bear with the nature of our egos. But at the same time, we have to train the ego so that its tendency to identification is directed to supersensuous things, supersensuous ideas and ideals. It has to be taught to associate itself with God. Then the ego learns to call itself the servant or child of God. The thing is, the ego seeks relationships. It becomes restless if it is left alone. The object of spiritual training is to give the ego spiritual relationships. You know, Sri Ramakrishna used to speak of two kinds of ego, the ripe and the unripe. The ego that says, I am the child of God, I am the servant of God, is the ripe ego. The unripe ego is that which attaches itself to different ideas and objects of worldly enjoyment. The ego that says, I am beautiful, I am powerful, I am wealthy. These identifications may be necessary in everyday life, but in the context of the highest spiritual goal, these notions are barriers. When I say, I am the body, I have covered my true self with a veil. It is for this reason that Sri Ramakrishna said that the point of spiritual life is to gradually transform the unripe ego into a ripe ego. When I do some work, I normally say, I am doing this. This is an expression of the unripe ego. But I can do the same work with a change in the ego's outlook. I can also try to remember this body, which does the work, is God's tool. God is the real agent. St. Paul used to say, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. This was how many of the close disciples and devotees of Sri Ramakrishna also used to work. Now the ego has become transformed. It has become the ripe ego. There can't be self-knowledge, that is, knowledge of the Atman, if the ego is left to its ignorant ways, sometimes identifying itself with this and sometimes with that. Each such identification becomes a link in a chain binding us to this relative existence. And so the vision of our true nature, of the Atman, remains far away. That is why we spiritual aspirants have to be careful about this ignorant ego. Now something interesting. When we say, I myself have done this, we say these things in order to emphasize ourselves, our point. We say, I myself have done this. We are using two terms. One is the I, the ordinary ego. But what is the self in myself? Ordinarily, we don't care to analyze why we use these two terms. We also say, you yourself have told me this. Or using the third person, we say, he himself had come there. So what is the implication of the word self in these three usages? Vedantic analysis shows the ego, the I, has only one face. It is only manifest in the first person. But self is common to all three persons. So it has three faces. It is behind him, it is behind you, and it is behind me. It is the unchanging, undeniable, immediately experienced consciousness behind all personalities. our minds, our intellects, our lives, even our world are all ultimately rooted in the self, in that eternal truth, though we don't ordinarily know this. We sometimes only have an implicit intuition of it. When we consciously try to discover this self, that implicit intuition becomes clearer and clearer. We become more and more conscious of our spiritual nature, and it becomes easier to give up false identifications. We've been accustomed to saying ignorantly, I'm a man, or I'm a woman, or I'm so and so. In order to break that habit, we have to assert, I am not the body and mind. I am pure consciousness. Or I am a child or servant of God. As our spiritual understanding deepens, and as the experience of the self becomes more explicit, we find that this experience has nothing to do with any kind of objective associations. That is why in higher Vedanta practices, the method often used is that of negation. Positive identification is necessary up to a certain stage of spiritual development. After that, the ego has to be taught to forget its old habit of identification and instead to practice saying, I am not this body, I am not this mind, I am not the five elements, I am not the vital energy, I am not thought, and so on. The ego has first to be trained to dissociate itself from whatever ideas of attachment that may arise in the mind. It's an extremely difficult task, but if we steadily train the ego to identify itself with the spirit, the ego can be detached, at least detached enough to take up the practice of negation. But does negation lead to emptiness? No. It eventually leads to the discovery of the self, which is beyond both affirmation and negation. The ego will then discover that its true nature has always been timeless existence, consciousness, and bliss, the vast tranquility and freedom that is the self. Not for a single moment are we anything but that. Now, the experience of the self is quite different from the experience of the ego. It doesn't have to take the form of I am. For the sake of contemplation, we have to use such language. I am He. I am pure Satchidananda. But in actual experience, there is no question of I. The actual experience can't be described in the language of the ego, because the self is not something that stands outside of myself. The self is my own true nature. It is the eternal subject of all experience. We can't express the self as an idea or in words, in the way we express a concept or describe an external object. That is why Vedanta says, neti, neti, not this, not this. The self can never be known as one knows an external object. The seeker is the self. When the veil of the ego identification is removed, the seeker finds that the self was always there. The ego points to the self, no doubt, but the self is revealed by its own nature, and that experience is impossible to describe in words. So what happens when self-knowledge comes? What is the gain? For one thing, Self-knowledge is the highest conceivable perfection that we can achieve. A passage from the Chandogya Upanishad says that when one realizes one's true nature, one finds that the self is not confined within one single body. I quote from the Upanishad now. The infinite is below, above, behind, before, to the right, to the left. I am all this. The infinite is the self. The self is below, above, behind, before, to the right, to the left. I am all this. In other words, the person of self-knowledge finds that the self is all-pervading consciousness. It is everywhere. It is the center of every individual. It is the center of the whole universe. It is the substratum, the ground, not only of the individual personality, but also of everything that the individual experiences. Time, space, everything is in the self. The scriptures say, one who knows the self goes beyond ignorance, beyond misery. Knowledge of the all-comprehensible truth, the self, gives one the highest fulfillment, the highest satisfaction. Then the Upanishad passage continues. One who knows, meditates upon, and realizes the truth of the self, such a one delights in the self, revels in the self, rejoices in the self. He becomes master of himself, master of all the worlds. Slaves they are who don't know this truth. He who has realized eternal truth, he sees everything as the self, he obtains everything. That means there is nothing more to be gained. When we were in the state of ignorance, the ego was a passionate seeker of company. But now we can tell the ego, you are a natural companion of the infinite. You don't need to seek company anymore. All objects, all beings are already within you. So the knower of the self doesn't require any other joy. The realized soul becomes the greatest emperor in this universe because everything has become one's own. Not even an atom can be excluded from the sovereignty of the realized soul. There can't possibly be any desire that is not fulfilled for such a soul. This is the state attained through self-knowledge. This is the goal that the ego must attain, the rediscovery of its real nature. But the big question is how to achieve this. That is the question. And that brings us to the more practical part of this talk, dehypnotizing ourselves. I assume most of us here remember our spiritual teachers and pray to them every day as part of our daily spiritual exercises. Every day we pray to the indwelling Guru to open our eyes, blinded by the disease of ignorance with the collyrium of knowledge. Every day we pray that we may be awakened from the sleep of ignorance. The very act shows that deep within ourselves we are conscious that we are in a state of spiritual unawareness, that we are not perceiving things rightly, that we are not seeing things as they really are, and that much of our pain and suffering is because of that. Deep down we feel that we are quite like a person caught in a hypnotic spell. A totally hypnotized person is no longer in charge of himself. He has surrendered his independence. He has no choice but to act as the hypnotizer bids. Luckily, or call it the grace of the indwelling Guru, we are better off. We are not so completely helpless or blind. We at least know our vision is greatly impaired, though impaired to an extent that is affecting our thinking and actions. And we seriously want to do something about it, which is why we are here, to explore ways and find solutions that might improve our situation. This is the first step towards recovering our original nature, the natural state of self-awareness, to understand that we have been hypnotized. We have to honestly admit to ourselves that we have let ourselves be captivated by this world. When we have fully accepted this fact, a feeling of intense dissatisfaction arises in us, and the process of dehypnotization becomes real. But this is easier said than done. Sri Ramakrishna gives the illustration of the moss on the still surface of a lake. We can't see the water below the covering of moss, but toss a brickbat into the lake, and the object scatters the moss at the point of impact, and the water shows through. Then what? Sri Ramakrishna says, after a few moments, even as the ripples are subsiding, the moss comes dancing from all sides and recovers the water. If you have watched this, you will agree that the way the moss comes dancing back on the ripples and covers the water is quite hypnotic. And I'm sure you will also agree that our own minds are not much different from the lake. Every now and then we take blows from the world, and each time our mind absorbs the shock somehow and we forget. Swami Vivekananda says, a mother brings up her child with the greatest care. Her whole soul, her whole life is in that child. It is the darling of her heart. In time, the boy grows up and turns out to be a brute. Day in and day out, he oppresses and torments her. But still, the mother clings to her child. And when her reason awakes, she covers it up with the idea of love. She doesn't know that it is not love, that it is something that has got hold of her nerves, which she is unable to shake off. However she may try, she just cannot give up the attachment. She cannot shake off the bondage she is in. The world glorifies it as a mother's unselfish love, not knowing that the mother is a born slave. She can't help it. She would 1,000 times rather disown the son, but she cannot. And this, Swamiji says, is Maya. She has hypnotized herself. These are Swamiji's words. Please think about it. But to return to what I was talking about, dissatisfaction. How are we to induce this feeling of dissatisfaction when we are actually charmed by the world? And then, how are we to rid ourselves of this mysterious hypnotism? Fortunately for us, we are not out and out worldly people who will never accept that they are hypnotized. But nor are we advanced spiritual aspirants who understand the many tricky ways in which the mind deludes us. For people like us, the way is practice. I know this sounds curious because can anybody come out of hypnosis by practice? How is a man to practice dehypnotization when he is already hypnotized? Moreover, isn't dehypnotization something that just happens naturally? Generally speaking, such natural and lasting dehypnotization occurs only in very rare cases, like in the lives of saints. They possess mental powers that we people don't have. They undergo the very same experiences that we do, but their reactions are different from ours. They learn from all their experiences, pleasant as well as unpleasant. And what they learn, they never forget. They are so highly sensitive. Gadadhar was a mere 7-year-old boy when his father died. But the experience made him conscious of the world's transitoriness, and he became Sri Ramakrishna. Prince Siddhartha saw, by chance, the scenes of old age, disease, and death, and that was enough to eject him out of the palace and into the forest in search of a solution to the problem of life, and he became Buddha. The difference between them and us is they never allowed the mass to come dancing back again, however mesmerizing it is, while we let that happen again and again. This is not to say that it always takes a bad experience to open our eyes, though that is largely true for us. Great souls learn from good, happy, pleasant experiences also. As I said, they learn from everything. I remember a striking observation Swami Yogatmanandaji made long ago during one of his retreats at our German center. He said, when you greet somebody, good morning, how are you? And he says, well, so. Then you ask him, what, brother? What is the matter? What is wrong? But if he gives you a beaming smile and says, great, I'm feeling fantastic, will you ask him, what, brother? What is the matter? What is so right? But this is what the great ones ask themselves constantly. What is it that makes people happy? What is the nature of this happiness? How long does it last? What happens when it is gone? What effects does it leave behind? They have very sharp minds, very keen intellects, and they relentlessly investigate into the real nature of things and events. Their hearts are like blast furnaces where base ore and pure metal are constantly being separated. They are always watchful and never lower their guard, so they are never caught. That is why they say eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. But now, let me leave the great ones alone. The main question was, can we dehypnotize ourselves by practice? And that too when we are already in a hypnotized state. The answer is yes, it is possible, though the process is slow and difficult. In fact, that is the only way left for average people like us. I don't mean average in the usual sense, because we are indeed special in one important respect. We may not be highly spiritual people, but we are not totally worldly either. We do have a spiritual outlook on life. Spiritual ideals appeal to our hearts. We want lasting spiritual solutions to our problems. And we are practicing spirituality as best as we can. In this sense, we have already begun the process of dehypnotizing ourselves. At least to this extent, we are less hypnotized. And that is no small achievement. Still, certain aspects of practical spirituality, like this very matter of self-dehypnotization, appear artificial in the beginning. This is because we have conditioned ourselves. We have conditioned ourselves through innumerable past lives to unquestioningly believe our unnatural condition to be natural. We have lost the habit of inquiring into the real nature of things. In our hypnotized state, we have come to regard unreal things as real, impermanent things as permanent, untruth as truth. And the only way we can reverse the situation is by undoing whatever we have done, by learning new ways of thinking, by trying to perceive things aright, by persistently pushing away the mass until it is too far off to return. Then we regain our original, natural, clear state of awareness. Now, what are the aids that will help us push the mass away? Of course, the brickbats. Repeated hurts, repeated disappointments will bring about disillusionment with the world. If we are sensitive enough, we can turn them to our advantage and make use of them. Their impact will shock us into action. But together with this sensitivity, we must also be strong. This is very important. Mere feelings of dissatisfaction or disgust don't bring about dehypnotization. On the contrary, in the absence of necessary strength, there is the greater danger of falling into a much more terrible fate, that of being haunted by anxiety and despair, grief and hopelessness, self-pity. When we are weak, these dangerous feelings will gain control over our minds and utterly destroy us. That is why we must never give in to weakness. To remain sunk in depression and helplessness is to surrender the glory and power of the Spirit to the forces of darkness. Sorrow, disappointment, and loss are unavoidable in life. But we shouldn't live in a habitual state of depression. Vedanta proclaims that the ever-pure Atman is the source of all strength and inspiration. Swami Vivekananda has said again and again that all misery and pain come from our dependence on matter. By arousing faith in the power and glory of the Atman, we should overcome all weakening influences with confidence. In one of his inspiring letters, Swamiji writes, "What makes you weep, my friend? In you is all power. Summon up your all-powerful nature, O mighty one, and the whole universe will be at your feet. It is the self alone that prevails, not matter." So our first task should be to discover and re-establish contact with the Atman within. But how to do this? With the help of the mind, of course. What else do we have? The nature of the mind is dynamic and can be changed by proper discipline. The mind records every form of experience that passes through it until the recorded part becomes our nature. This is a psychological law that forms the basis of all types of spiritual meditation. This is how we can transform the mind by dwelling on the nature of the higher self. By intensely concentrating the mind on the nature of the real self, we can awaken in ourselves the forgotten memory of it. But our whole mind should flow towards that one goal. That is the condition. By constant meditation, we finally realize that we are the Atman and not the body or the mind. This doesn't mean that this kind of meditation is also a kind of auto-suggestion, another kind of self-hypnotism. Though the ultimate reality is beyond the experience of the ordinary mind, it can be directly realized by the purified mind. So, meditation in this case is not on something unreal, but on the real. Reality shines by itself. What meditation does is prevent the rise of thoughts contrary to the truth. The Atman is self-luminous and ever-present behind our mind. When thoughts are stilled through concentration, the Atman shines forth spontaneously. And dehypnotization becomes an accomplished task. But let us not assume that this kind of meditation is easy. For one thing, it takes an extraordinarily objective, dispassionate mind to practice it. And most of us are anything but that. We are highly emotional, however we may seem from outside. The world is very, very real to us, and it affects us deeply. In fact, we are carried away by the world, whether we like it or not, whether we admit it or not. Then what is the way out for us? Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord, by his power of Maya, causes all beings to turn round and round as if they were mounted on a machine. This divine Maya of his is hard to overcome. Those who take refuge in him alone can cross beyond it. This brings us to prayer and self-surrender to the divine. This is also an equally potent means of avoiding the snares of Maya, illusion. And for hypnotized people like us, who have difficulty handling our emotions, feelings, and sentiments, it is a much more realistic alternative because it is easier, more natural for us to practice. For that matter, Sri Ramakrishna himself used to pray like this. I am quoting his own words. O God, I am without devotion and austerity, without knowledge and love. I haven't performed any religious rites. O God, I have taken refuge in Thee. I have taken shelter at Thy feet. I don't want creature comforts. I don't seek name and fame. O God, I don't crave power. I am Thy servant. I have taken refuge in Thee. Grant, O God, that I may have pure love for Thy holy feet, that I may not be deluded by thy world-bewitching Maya. O God, I have taken refuge in thee. This kind of prayer and surrender is not an escape. For bhaktas, devotees of God, it is the best, most practical solution. Others can take it or leave it. So, to sum it all up, as we learn to spiritualize every experience that we go through, we gradually awaken from our long dream. We become more observers than participants. And when we have grown in discernment and detachment, in prayer and surrender, we will have gone a long way in dehypnotizing ourselves. God help us. Thank you. Before we close, I have a couple of announcements to make. Tomorrow is Monday, but we won't be having our regular Panchadashi class. Swami Sumanasanandaji of Hollywood, he will be with us. And if we'll be having an informal satsang with him. Nothing definite is planned, but we are going to have a satsang. And those of you who want to meet him are welcome to attend prayer, meditation, and we'll be having potluck dinner downstairs in the basement. And then there will be this satsang. And next Sunday, our Swami Chidbrahmanandaji, he will be giving a talk on the subject of needless religion. I repeat, next Sunday, we'll be having a talk by Chidbrahmanandaji on needless religion. Please be sure to attend these two functions. Thank you all. And now, Kusumji will give us a closing song. After that, we can go downstairs and have some